Hello and welcome to Cyber Focus. My name is Joel Arnold. Our guest today is Professor Jeff Hart. He's a specialist in international politics and international political economy at Indiana University. Professor Hart, thank you for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here.
Right. You recently made a presentation in China regarding the global flat panel display industry. Could you summarize kind of what your findings were in that speech that you gave?
Yes, the talk was about my research and how I'd gotten to a certain point in the research and needed to know more about what was going on in China. So when I started the research on the global flat panel display, what had happened was that most of the production had started off being in Japan, even though the technology was mostly invented in the United States. And then by the end of the research, it had moved mostly to Taiwan and Korea. Mm-hmm. And I knew that between the time that I finished that research and the present, mm-hmm. There had been relocation of production to China. Mm-hmm. So the question was China on a trajectory to do what the Koreans and the Taiwanese had done? Okay. So that's what the talk was about.
So as you mentioned, shift in production is going toward China. How does that sort of, if that does occur as you expect it to, how will that change the industry's dynamics?
Well, so one of the reasons that production is shifting to China is because of the demand for products that require flat panel displays. So that ranges from flat screen TVs down to small displays on mobile phones. Mm-hmm. And because the Chinese economy is growing so rapidly, the demand has shifted there. So the Chinese naturally want to have more production domestically for the products that are being consumed domestically. Mm-hmm. The problem for them is that they didn't necessarily have the technological capability to manufacture those things themselves. Mm. So they had to decide whether to support domestic firms or to allow foreign firms to operate inside China.
Within the industry, there seems to be a convergence of functionality between, as you mentioned, cell phones with flat panel displays, as well as anything as large as a home entertainment system with a television. Mm-hmm. As that convergence continues, does that change any of these dynamics, or is it kind of status quo?
Well, we have seen a lot of convergence on different kinds of platforms. So the mobile platform has become a small computer. The smartphone is basically a mm-hmm. small computer, and it's connected to the internet just the way desktops are. Mm-hmm. And however, it's a small screen. Mm-hmm. And then at the home, a lot of people still have TV sets mm-hmm. connected to cable systems and satellite systems and so forth. And sometimes they have internet on their TV. But what we found through interviews with consumers is that the use patterns for the different types of screen formats are quite mm-hmm. different. So there is convergence in terms of the electronics mm-hmm. and access to the internet and a few other things. But there's still very different use patterns for the big screens versus the little screens.
And do you see that continuing, or do you kind of see the way that people access media and technology to be, as they get used to these converged platforms, to mm-hmm. be more standard across all of them?
No, I think there's still a lot of demand in the mass consumer audience for passive entertainment, basically. Mm-hmm. And so that probably won't change too much. And there are a lot of people who really don't want to fuss with all the stuff that you have to fuss with to have your computer system, where whatever mm-hmm. platform it's on, work sure. for you. So I don't think that's going to change radically. But on the other hand, there's a lot more computer-like functionality for things mm-hmm. that used to be purely passive, and mm-hmm. that's what's changed, I think.
Yeah. The switching gears here a little bit, what can a government do? Obviously, you mentioned some of the role that China's government has played in, spurring investment in areas, in particular into flat panel displays. What should a government do in order to make themselves more attractive to FDI or foreign direct investment in this space?
All the usual things apply. So whatever makes you attractive to inward flows of foreign direct investment includes good infrastructure, the right kinds of public policies, an educated workforce. It's pretty much the same thing. The big difference between rich countries like the United States and low-income countries is that we can't compete on the basis of low wages. So we have to put more emphasis on skills and education in order to justify the higher salaries.
You mentioned skills and education. Does that, how much does that play a role in the investment initiatives in IT manufacturing in a highly technical space, or are they essentially the same?
Well, I think IT plays a role in increasing the productivity of our educational services. So we need to be thinking more about, first of all, access to information technology and particularly communication systems, where we've gotten a little bit behind in broadband, and we need to really come back up into leadership position in a lot of these areas. And then we need to really focus in on our strengths in basic research and in the sort of startup culture that we are very vigorous in the United States.
You mentioned how the technology and manufacturing production kind of shifted from the United States to Japan and Korea, and now shifting from Korea and Japan to China.
Right.
How do developing economies beyond China, let's say other countries in Southeast Asia, the Vietnams, the Bangladesh, India, those kind of places, are they developing this kind of attraction and this kind of pull in this industry, or what can they do to do that?
I don't think so in this industry. I think China's the logical next place because of the huge domestic demand, and also very extensive capability to focus national resources. So it's not likely that a country like Vietnam, for example, would be able to compete with, first of all, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. And there's still some question as to whether the Chinese will be able to do it without quite a lot of help. It looks like they're already inviting the biggest foreign firms to set up joint ventures in China, and I think that's the way it's going to go for the immediate future. But I don't really think that a small, less developed country can get into this particular game.
Okay. There are currently, and I was reading your presentation, there are currently 0 display manufacturing companies located in the United States these days.
Right.
You mentioned Korea and Japan, and now it's the shift to China. Is this, first of all, an issue for the United States, and particularly like a political issue and something that should be addressed?
I don't think this particular industry has been politically salient. I mean, there was a time back in the 80s when people wanted to have U.S. national champions in the display industry. For a while, it looked like Texas Instruments would be doing okay with its DLP televisions, which were partly funded by the Defense Department. But it never really materialized, and the reason is U.S. firms didn't want to invest in an industry where there were very, very huge capital costs, and the competition was really brutal. So they figured they could invest their money more productively in other areas. But I think the issue that it raises is that we compete in this world where countries like China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan all have adopted a kind of developmental state strategy with lots of industrial policy instruments. And we don't, for the most part, use those same kinds of instruments. We do in some sectors. So the question is, how do we as a country compete with the Chinas, Taiwans, Koreas, and Japans of the world? And we have to kind of go off of our traditional preference for a minimally intrusive state.
Do you see, you mentioned the comparative cost of labor, you mentioned political initiatives. Do you see the lack of this kind of manufacturing being headquartered in or housed in the United States as indicative of a larger human capital issue within the United States, lack of engineering, lack of scientific research in any area?
No, I don't think the problem is lack of investment in science and engineering. One of the problems that many other scholars have highlighted is that our scientists and engineers have gone into the wrong sectors in some ways. A lot of them went into the financial services industry, and we do seem to have trouble getting people to go into manufacturing, for example. So So mechanical engineering and manufacturing engineering is kind of a weak spot. So there could be a lot better use of vocational education in this area, and then we could change the priorities to some degree of where the prestigious jobs are. But I don't see that changing in a radical way in the near future.
Is there any way that you see it, as you mentioned, changing the priorities? How would we change the priorities? Is it just monetary incentives, or?
No, I think a lot of it is symbolic. So, most of the rest of the world really honors their engineers and scientists in different ways than we do. So that would be a cultural change. And I think the other thing is we tend to put down people who have jobs that involve actually making things. And so somehow, I just remember watching Mr. Rogers when he went to factories, for example. And I was fascinated with factories, but I'm not sure that the latest generation has the same. Maybe the little kids do, but somehow they lose it by the time they become adults.
What competitive advantages do the nations that are currently in the lead, Japan and Korea, have over the increasingly sophisticated Chinese manufacturer?
They have devoted quite a lot of effort to developing a very strong science and engineering culture. And also the firms in those countries have invested very heavily in research and development. So I don't think the Chinese firms have quite yet grasped how much of an effort they have to lay out to catch up with the rest of the world. So they've done okay in the areas which are labor intensive and take advantage of their low labor costs. They do have low engineering costs. So a typical Chinese engineer costs about $10,000 a year. That's compared with $80,000 in the United States and $30,000 in Korea, maybe a little bit less in other places of the world. But so having cheap engineers is a big advantage for the Chinese. And so,
for the quality tests that are coming out of China, the products manufactured in China versus the products that are currently manufactured in Korea, for example, are they on par with each other, or do you see a drop-off in quality, consistency, those sort of things?
Well, I think that varies by product. So we did go to a car plant in China, a Chinese car plant, and it didn't look like the cars there were going to be quite the same as the cars made by Japanese or U.S. firms or European firms. And you didn't see as many Chinese brands out on the street as you saw foreign brands. So that's actually part of this whole story, is that they don't necessarily champion their domestic manufacturers in the way that other countries have done. So if you go to Korea, you won't see that many U.S. Brand cars or Japanese brand cars, and lots of Korean brand cars. It's just, that sort of favoring the domestic manufacturers. Don't see that in China, but I think that actually is a realistic adaptation to the way things are in that particular industry. Also, when we went to a TV studio in China, they had the latest Japanese equipment and a little bit of U.S. equipment. So they were basically, they're not burdened by not invented here, and they do look for the best stuff that's available.
How about in display technology?
It's the same thing in display. In fact, the one big display plant that we went to, it turned out it was a joint venture of a Japanese firm with NEC, with a Shanghai Valley Authority, SVA, and all the equipment was Japanese because it was a Japanese joint venture. But my guess is as they move toward more later generation plants, they may change that a bit.
All right. Thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us today.
Okay, thanks.
And thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Cyber Focus crew, my name is Joel Arnold. We appreciate you being with us. If you have any comments or concerns, or if you have a recommendation for a topic for our next show, please reach out to us at cyber@indiana.edu. Thanks.